I'm actually an expert on Islamic philosophy. That's what I'm supposed to be doing according to the NWO. But the side project, the things that I've been working on sort of on the side over the last few years have taken over a bigger shape, meaning digital solutions that we can incorporate into our workflow as researchers and students in the humanities. One other note, maybe before, I'm a friar of the Order of Preachers. That's why I dressed like this. And I'm going to make some bold statements this hour, just to sort of, get the conversation going. So even though I might look like the part, I'm not a prophet, and the future is what we make of it. And I only hope to inspire you to make something great out of it. Now, I've divided my talk into 4 acts that sort of can stand on each on their own. They give a different perspective of the same story in a way, and so together we get a more comprehensive view of what's going on. The first act is called The Tech Drums Call, Arise. I'm just gonna, there we go. And you see, it seems to me that digital humanities, without going exactly into what DH is at the moment, is reliant on the tech industry. And this is, of course, a good thing, because we don't have the manpower or financial means to create fundamentally new technology. It's a much wiser investment, so to say, to use what the tech industry is developing and make that into something that is useful for our purposes. So, for example, the TEI Encoding Standard is a way to encode text in a scholarly, useful manner, and this is was and is developed by academic stakeholders, but it's using XML, which is something that the tech industry has developed, right? Now, in the 2010s, there has been a sort of a changing data climate, you might say, and there's been a rise of the so-called NoSQL databases, and so before, databases just had the normal appearance of different tables that were connected to each other, and using SQL or SQL as a basic programming language to interact with them. But then came databases like Cassandra or HBase or MongoDB, and this has been sort of going on in the last 10-20 years. Now, what I'm going to show you here, this is from Stack Overflow, which is the premier destination on the web for programmers to ask and answer questions. We see here the relative frequency of discussions on 2 such NoSQL databases, Neo4j and OrientDB. And we can see that they kind of peaked in the 2014, 2015, 2016. So it gives us a sort of a crude measure of when a technology is developing, because that's exactly when people in the tech industry are starting to discuss exactly how it works. Here I'm going to show you something else. This is actually from YouTube, because it can give us an interesting measure when a technology is becoming popular enough for people to start making tutorials, instruction videos about it. And so we see that actually it is more popularized in 2016, 2017, 2018. Now, I'm showing you this information about graph databases because of the NoSQL databases. It was exactly this graph database that seemed most useful for the humanities. And indeed, what is currently the latest, like the hottest trend in the age, it's to represent data as a graph using a graph database. So, what I'm arguing here is that technology develops in the tech industry, becomes popular enough to gain traction, and then as we speak in 2018, 2019, we see a huge adoption of it in the humanities. And so likewise, we can ask ourselves, what will be the next step? What will be the next trend in the humanities, in digital humanities? And I think for anybody who's followed the tech industry in the last few years, the answer has actually already been said a few times today. It's machine learning. These are two of the most, among the most popular libraries for machine learning, TensorFlow and Keras. And so we see that it actually neatly lines up with graph databases. As graph databases sort of became less discussed, machine learning started to rise. And what is the part of machine learning that is most attractive to the humanities? Just like if of the NoSQL databases, it was graph databases that were specifically chosen in the humanities. So computer vision will be chosen, I think, of machine learning that is most attractive to the humanities. So as 2018, 2019 are the years of graph databases for the humanities, 2020 will be the year of computer vision for the humanities, when it's going to hit the humanities in a much larger way. Because of course there are pioneers, there are people who have been using this already for perhaps more than a decade, but we're going to see a much different kind of adoption, a much larger adoption. And what am I thinking then? What kind of adoption? I'm just going to show you some of the things that I do. This is something that I've been working on. So this over here is a codex of an Islamic manuscript. And manuscripts from the Islamic world, they have this typical flap over here. So it goes from the back onto the top to really close the codex. And I wondered, could I, based on an image, could I say something about that flap? So I reduced the image using OpenCV. I reduced it to this to really bring out the contrast of the flap against the background. And then I use a couple of tricks to correctly identify with the red point over here the tip of the flap, and the yellow points the outer points. And when you have those 3 points, then you can calculate the angle, of course. Then it becomes just simple mathematics. And the beauty of this is that once you can do it for one manuscript, you can do it for as many as you like. So I did it for a couple of thousand, and got this. And so it was interesting to see that actually like 90% or more of all the manuscripts that I used fell right in between 155 degrees and 160 degrees, basically. Of course, this is something that requires more work, but I mean, it's a start, basically. It's something to think about, but it could perhaps be used as a different data point to identify a manuscript coming from a certain region or a certain time period. Here I just show it all as sort of the workflow that I've been using. What I just showed was manuscripts. This is books. So we start here with images of a scanned book, right? And then I thought, like, okay, I actually would like to have this in plain text. How can I do that? And so the first step I did was, you can probably see it quite well. I identified like commas and shaddas and colons in order to here I highlight them, but actually what I did was I whited them out so as to delete them, so as to make the entire page more clean. I did it also with the footnotes and other elements. And so then you get a much cleaner image that an OCR engine will find much easier to digest, of course. What I did then was what you can see over here. It's just a simple histogram. It's not very complicated in terms of programming code. It was just a few lines of code. So it just shows kind of the number of black pixels, and on the top you see it mapped out for if you would drop down exactly from top to bottom. And so since the margins are of course completely white, there are no black pixels, there's nothing, and only for the text block you will end up with result. And doing it in this way, you can identify the lines, of course. And so then, as I already showed here, then you can just vertically divide or segment the image into different lines. And so then I knew exactly where the text was, where the lines of text was, and I extracted the text line by line, and I knew that the first line was just page number, so I dropped that. And I also told the computer that if he would land on this, that it meant that that's everything below is footnotes, and to just ignore it. And so then you get the fifth line is this. And this I then fed to Tesseract in this case, but there are a couple of OCR engines, of course, to get the plain text. And as you can see, I automatically had added LB-5, line break number 5. This is a TEI convention for encoding a line. To show to you, you can create an entire sort of pipeline, if you will, from scanned images to TEI compilable XML that you can further use. And it's these kinds of things that I hope we'll see more of. And the beauty of doing it myself is that I have control over every step, and I can sort of direct the attention of the computer to exactly those aspects that I want. Perhaps if I was interested in the footnotes, I could program it in such a way that only the footnotes would be extracted, right? So, how to get ready for this? Well, if you're a librarian, and many of you are, I think, then I think it is a very good step indeed to develop polished tools, some of which we've seen today. I think they can be an excellent first step towards getting people acquainted with CV, to have a sort of low barrier entry into what computer vision can do. And this will also put yourself very well prepared for next steps beyond polished tools. What if scholars are asking more of you? And if you're a student or scholar, well, then I think now more than ever is a really great time to spend even just one evening per week on some of these technologies. These are some of the big names that I can think of that are very worthwhile exploring. Python as sort of your Swiss Army knife for programming, and then the more specific libraries like OpenCV and NumPy. ImageMagick is also very useful for converting different image formats on a large automated scale. So I think, in short, the year computer vision is going to make a much bigger impact in the humanities is just around the corner. So that's Act 1. Act 2, the data we have is the data we need. Now, when cars were first made, they looked like horse carriages, right? And we still actually use the term horsepower. And when keyboards were first made, they looked like typewriters, and we still use the QWERTY keyboard layout. So, in a way, I find it not surprising that digitized books and manuscripts looked, or still look, much like physical books and manuscripts. And what I mean is that they are considered as such. If you think about it, they are invariably offered as page spreads, images that show as though it's an open book or manuscript. They are placed in a linear sequential order, page after page, with buttons to move to the next page, and sometimes even sort of the gimmicky thing where you can drag a corner and it will show sort of an animation of a page turning. And so the idea suggested here that physical books are primarily meant for reading, and preferably page by page. And so it also means that you do see that in many digitization projects, only the texts are photographed. Only things that have text are photographed. Further, the items are only visible on the library website through a portal, basically. So it's kind of very similar as going to special collections, whereas before I had to see a manuscript by going to special collections and leaving all my stuff behind and then sitting down at the desk. Now I have to go to this one specific website and I can look at the manuscript. And especially commercial vendors take this in a terrible direction. I think I'm thinking of ProQuest eBook Central. I think this is a really bad idea to kind of imprison the files and do whatever they can to not have you access to the actual thing. So I hope nobody of ProQuest is here. No? Good. So then there's the curious case that digitized books and manuscripts are almost exclusively made visible and findable by relying on existing catalogs that have themselves perhaps been digitized. So all of this means that digitized manuscripts are set up and therefore used as you would use physical books, right? And this is still great. It's really great to be able to pull up a certain manuscript and start analyzing it right from my workspace at home. And in fact, this is of course a reality for many scholars, a reality that you helped build. But the bigger that pile of digitized books become, the more pertinent the question becomes, now what? The amount of digitization has become so large that as we will continue to digitize, for sure, we can now and also should think of what is the next step with all of this. And I think the first step is to consider that when you say digitized book, we shouldn't just consider it as a book, but we should consider it as digitized, meaning it's data. And the whole reason for putting things in a computer, in most cases, is exactly to let the computer do something for you rather than you do it yourself. And so data usually has this beauty to it that it's readable by humans, but also readable by computers. This particular data that we have, we can read with our vision. And so the main entryway for computers to start making sense of this material is computer vision, as I see it. So it is with computer vision that we can move forward. And this argument goes both ways in a way, because what do we need for computer vision? We need images, which we have. We have plenty of them. So it's not only possible to move forward, but I would say it's also time to move forward in this direction. So here's something that I made in just a few days, actually. These are so I cut out some seals. These are ownership statement seals from manuscripts, and having access to couple of thousand manuscripts, I tried to write something that would find those seals in those manuscripts. And I can't show a live demo, it would take too much time, but you would get results like this, right? Would show the exact position with the right name, the sultanic seal on top there. And even though there's a big chunk out of it, it still identified it correctly. Here's just another example. You know, I'm very interested to see what libraries can do with this kind of thinking, and how they can enhance their catalogs if they include this kind of data in their catalogs. Here's another something I made. I made it nice looking so as to be more attractive. But the main point is that what we're looking at is one manuscript that consists of 300 or more images. And of each image, I kind of extracted only the ink. And then I stacked all those ink layers on top of each other. And I made a heat map where if places where there's always ink are red, places where there's barely ink are blue. And so we can kind of see the skeleton of the manuscript here. We have, in one image, we have a representation of all those 300 images of the entire manuscript. So this is another way, just like the histogram, this is another way to arrive at line numbers, at the layout of the manuscript, and it's of course also an entryway to find glosses, of course, because now you know where the body of the text is. So now you can search through all those images again to find exactly where there are where there's considerable ink spots, so to say, in the margins. Again, how to get ready for this in this regard. And if you're a librarian, I think the main thing to think about in this regard is disclosing your photos not only through a user interface, but consider also giving programmatic access to manuscripts. And if you will, only two parts, of course. You can set this up in a way that is of your liking, with an API with private key that has a data cap, for example. And that also means that you shouldn't forget to digitize all the parts. And I know it's being done more and more, but it is of course very important to also have photos of the cover, of the spine, of flyleaves, anything that belongs to the artifact, because they might not be useful for reading, that's true, but they might give us very interesting metadata, especially if we combine it with all those large numbers. And I also want to add here, please don't add watermarks. That of course ruins everything, and then it's just sort of, effort is lost. So, and I know that many libraries still do it. So, please consider not doing it. But here's something that you should be doing, which I don't think actually any library does. And I've looked at a lot of repositories. It would be really great if you could bake into the image just a tiny strip at the bottom, the provenance of the image. And I don't mean sort of the manuscript provenance, but I just mean your city, your library, the manuscript shelf number, the folio number. Because yes, if you look at these images in a sequence, then you know what manuscript it belongs to. But if you start pulling out these images randomly from different manuscripts, then over time you will not know where exactly this image has come from. And it would be really great to be able to always know exactly, like, okay, where did I get this image from? What is this image exactly? And another point in this regard is that, as I said, catalog data, I think, can be really enhanced with computer vision approaches. And I think it would be really great to see catalogs enriched with this kind of data that perhaps falls outside of categories that are normally a part of a catalog, and maybe there are ways to work around this, maybe some sort of shadow catalog for your digitized holdings. But of course you will sooner or later also get requests of researchers to get programmatic access to the catalog, not just being able to search it as through a portal, but also requests for sort of mining it, if you will. And this is also something to consider. I know catalogs are closely guarded by libraries, but again, maybe there are ways to work around this and bring research to a next level. And well, as for students and scholars, I think one very important thing to do here is to keep asking and not settle for less, so to say, and to bring forward well-argued project proposals that even if they require API access, to keep knocking at the doors of libraries to say, like, okay, we really need this now. And I say this because I've been trying to do this, and so far I haven't had much success, so I need more people knocking. So the data we have is the data we need, and now is the time to restructure and rethink how we can offer that kind of data so that we can make optimally use of it. That's end of Act 2. Act 3. Method precedes real possibility. Now, academic work cannot be done in a vacuum. We situate our work among other works so as to add to a discussion, and we make use of certain methodologies so that we're more guaranteed of fruitful research and meaningful results. Now, I was impressed by the following book, Hypertext by George Landau, and he discusses what literary theorists such as Derrida and Barthes, Foucault, all of those names, what they were talking about, and then he compares that with the digital world we live in today. And what I took away from it is that the criticism of these literary theorists that was actually a criticism against the print world with dissatisfaction with several ways peculiar to the print world. But interestingly, many of these points of dissatisfaction were solved with the rise of the digital world. And so at the time, their criticism may have sounded all right, but with no real solution in sight. Yet here we are, we're able to fully account for what they were saying. And it also means that once hypertext and digital media and the internet became real things, we already had methods and ways of thinking about that. And we weren't just sort of standing there empty-handed. I'll give you an example of what I mean. This is Roland Barthes, and he says, the goal of literary work is to make the reader no longer a consumer, but a producer of the text. Our literature is characterized by the pitiless divorce which the literary institution maintains between the producer of the text and its user, between its owner and its consumer, its author and its reader. This reader is thereby plunged into a kind of idleness. Reading is nothing more than a referendum. So, what I see here when I compare it with this as a characterization of the print world is that the reader is confronted by this perfectly crisp white page with perfectly crisp black letters that are stamped into it, and nothing can be done about it. Sort of a final product that you're just faced with. And so you are just sort of standing there in a sort of idleness. And the referendum that he is referring to means that only over time can there be a dialogue, and only in a very small sense, only after a long time when publishers start to notice that certain sales are not doing so well, they will change their decisions on what books to publish. But it's the publishers who are sort of the gatekeepers here of text production. So the publishers as the medium then, the medium is the actual producer of text. And this is very different from manuscript world, where I would say the reader is actually the producer, because the reader seeks out a text and either copies it himself or asks a copyist to do that for them. And thereby the reader takes on a very active approach, and also is able to engage in a dialogue directly on paper. And you also see the entire process of the dialogue on paper. You see words scratched out, marginal notes being made, corrections, and so you see the whole process of how the text came about. And in the digital world, some of that is kind of solved again, taken back again, because it is, it's not, I would say it's not the reader who's producing the text, it's the author, but anybody can be an author, because yes, you're faced with an end product, you're just faced with text on screen or an image, But you can, at any point, especially if you get a Word document, you can just click anywhere and you can start typing and you create a new document. So in this sense, there is no original with copies like in the print world, but there are only copies, which are all equal to each other and which can be made at the click of a button, basically. Now, much more can be said about it, but I want to go to two methodologies or two criticisms that have been raised more recently, and that I think are sort of in the same kind of dynamic, where they weren't fully understood at the time of conception, but they might be very useful later on. And these are new philology and distant reading. So new philology was proposed in the 90s already, spearheaded by Stephen Nichols, and he started from the observation that among medievalists, and we might add all pre-modern historians, he said that the medieval artifact had become the edited text. So if you want to read a medieval text, you no longer go and take a manuscript, but you go and take an edition. And that is what you consider the medieval text. And this kind of attitude then leads to this impression that surplus variations in the manuscript tradition cease to have any critical interest because they simply reflect scribal errors. They're errors rather than interesting things to investigate. And so Nichols says we have seriously neglected the important supplements that were part and parcel of medieval text productions, such as visual images, annotations of various forms, such as rubrics, captions, glosses, and interpolations. So we can kind of hear echoes of Roland Barthes and Gerard Genette in this, but in manuscript studies, this was a fresh, new point to be made, and it was at first considered with great interest, but perhaps hasn't really lived up to its expectations. I've seen some very fruitful applications of it, but at the cost of a great amount of labor. And meanwhile, it might be argued that the general trend has been more the opposite way, a radicalization of the printed text, because as the digital world came on, we wanted to make digital text corpora, and we mostly used print materials for that as our basis. And in many cases, we actually did away with critical apparatus or a sort of checking of OCR or of typographic errors. And so a more narrow version of the text as it was became the ultimate representation in the digital world. Now, if you really want to know what a text says or what a text means, this is unacceptable. This is not useful. I'm going to give you one example. I'm going to be a bit short about it. I'm going to cut some corners. But just to give you a sense of it, I'm thinking of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was one of the greatest Muslim intellectuals of all times. And even though he was one of the greatest intellectuals, he's also a favorite of terrorists of our time. And you know, they quote him of his large corpus. They take bits and pieces that are useful to them, but are perhaps not a real good representation of who he is. And there is one text that really exemplifies this. It's called the Martyrdom Fatwa. It's a ruling about a place called Martyrdom where there were Muslims, non-Muslims, there was an invading army, there were all kinds of conflicting parties, and Ibn Taymiyyah was to rule how to live as a Muslim in this kind of situation. And the very last sentence of the fatwa, as it was for the first time printed around 1900, in the print edition it says, "And non-Muslims are to be killed as they deserve." And this was then repeated in every print edition since, and it was quoted many times by terrorists, perhaps not as their biggest argument, but surely as an argument to show that Ibn Taymiyyah would support their dealings. And as such, it has also entered the digital text corpora like Maktiba Ashamila and the scholarly project OpenITI. But only recently it was pointed out that if you look at manuscripts, if you look at the oldest manuscripts, it clearly shows that this is a typographic error and that it should not say non-Muslims should be killed as they treated, but should be killed as they deserve, but should be treated as they deserve. Mm-hmm. And when you read it in the entire context of the fatwa, it means a positive way. It means to treat them well as they deserve. So it's the very exact opposite, really. And so it shows, I hope it shows well enough that you cannot trust texts from a digital corpus if they are not born digital or if they're not print native. And so a solution to this, I think, is right there already. It's because of huge digitization projects that we can actually quite easily and quickly ameliorate our readings of digital text corpora by going back to manuscripts. And so I think this is what we're definitely going to see, that there is going to be a much bigger use of manuscripts in order to supplement our readings of digital texts. Now, but I want to be more ambitious here and say that we shouldn't stop here, because that's a great success, okay, but it doesn't satisfy what Nichols was actually after, namely an appreciation of manuscript culture that goes beyond the correct reading of the text. So, with the return to investigating manuscripts in light of suspect digital texts, the challenge that Nichols presents becomes only more apparent and pertinent. Now, before we get to a solution, let's move to the other thing I mentioned, distant reading. This is, as far as I understand, coming from literary theory. Franco Moretti championed this and constructed the term as an opposite to close reading. All right, and he observed that we only focus on the classics that make up the canon, but almost by definition, and anybody who's done archival work will know the vast majority of literature ever produced is not part of the canon. So are we not missing something very substantial if we're not looking at 99% of all texts? Here's the key passage that I want to highlight. Moretti says, one last thing that became clear was the enormous difference between the archive of the great unread and the world of the canon. You enter the archive and the usual coordinates disappear. All you can see are swarms of hybrids and oddities. So what he says here is that our usual methods fail to work when we approach such a large and unknown body of literature. We cannot do close reading because we'll get nowhere with it. But this doesn't mean that it disqualifies as an object of scholarly investigation. It simply means that we need different methods. And so in comes distant reading. And the idea is to find trends and to string together different pieces of literature, hopping in rapid succession from one work to another. And as he himself shows, this works best if we have the entire corpus in digital text, of course, because then we can let a computer do all sorts of analyses. Now, the difficulty is that this is not something we always have, and especially for corpora that were not considered to be part of the canon, we don't have them in digital text, in plain text format. And even if we settle on using OCR for printed materials, the objection still stands since the vast majority of our archives are manuscripts. So the distant reading approach has mostly been a dream up until now, and I've heard people say, well, it kind of failed. It's perhaps nothing more than a fancy kind of close reading, and it doesn't really add anything. It doesn't have any extra saying power. So if new philology is interested in anything but deciding what the exact text of manuscript should be. And a distant reading is interested in anything but small-scale readings of what the exact text of an archival object is. Then they haven't failed, they simply were ahead of their times. What both need is automated analysis of large sets of manuscripts. And for that, two conditions need to be met. So one condition, obviously, is that we need a lot of digitized manuscripts. This is something we have now. The other condition is that we need software that can analyze that kind of data, much like the software to analyze a corpus in plain text. And the plain and simple answer to that requirement is, of course, computer vision. That's the kind of software that can analyze this kind of data. So I would say the methodological ramp has been laid for the last 20 years, and it's now time to get into our CV cars and race along that methodological ramp and see how far we can get. How to prepare for this? As librarians, you might want to think how offering digitized artifacts will be most profitable. So in the previous act we touched on technical decisions you can make, but here on methodology there are other things to consider. For example, we're in the habit of digitizing the holdings per institution, one institution after another. And this creates a collection of that institution, but does it actually create a cohesive collection in one way or another? Take for example this initiative, Afghanistan Digital Library, developed I believe by NYU Library. It says the Afghanistan Digital Library will retrieve and restore works published in Afghanistan between 1870 and 1930. This is just perfect. It is a neatly defined corpus of text. It has a reasonable claim to completion, and this is just waiting to be used by computer vision. I know that with standards like IIIF, we can already pull in different resources from different repositories, different libraries. But I think the onus of the work, the burden of the work cannot just be on research. And I think libraries, with this as a fine example, can play a major role in this as well. And for students and scholars, well, I wish to encourage to not limit your scope, to really think beyond the sort of your normal reach of research questions. The challenges that new philology and distant reading have brought up, they are still standing, and picking up those challenges by means of computer vision will ensure wide attention, I'm sure. Or rather, if you wonder what computer vision truly can do for the humanities, then look no further. The methodology was already there, and this is only the practical realization of it. End of Act 3. Act 4, forget everything you know about digital humanities. So the digital humanities has made itself into a discipline, and while the term is fairly recent, its history goes back much further. Before, it was known as humanities computing or literary computing, and before that it didn't even have a name, but it was still a distinct group of people working on distinct sets of problems. Now, a pesky problem that has crept in from the very beginning was that DH research has always been informed by a desire to be at the cutting edge of technology, and in this way to push the field of DH further. And this is understandable, but it also means that as DH has pushed further and further, the gap with, say, classical humanities has turned into kind of a chasm. It's a big divide now. And perhaps some people will find this all right, but I don't. I think it will lead to DH becoming, perhaps already being, incomprehensible by their peers. And it will ultimately lead, I think, to a rejection by the majority who is not tech savvy. It's not easy to make quantitative arguments that are well understood and or well received in our fields. And if a piece of technology is mystifying, just a black box, then in a way it's not falsifiable. And so I think that those are serious objections, because that kind of fundamentally disqualifies it as scientific. It makes it unsuitable for scholarly use in a way. But I think we are at a breaking point in a good sense. I think there's only a little effort needed to see a drastic change in the DH landscape. And this breaking point is an ever larger group of people in, say, classical humanities who are eager or who are already using technology in their day-to-day work. And so I think if we have regular humanities over here and digital humanities over there, then I think the solution, the way forward, is to fill up that space in between. And like I said, I think we are very close there. So we can consider that landscape, the DH spectrum, and see where people fall. And I've identified different archetypes. And the first one, I hope you can see it in the back, it's called the believer. So this is, of course, just the sort of the professional DHer. His or her field is digital humanities, and they are interested in pushing technology to the maximum to see how they can improve technology. And if you would go to a conference like DH 2019 this summer in Utrecht, you would see this type of person all over the place. The second one, which is very close, is the sour one. Now, these are people who have had good intentions in the past, not so much anymore in a way. They are very tech savvy, they've done a lot of work, but they've always had a desire to integrate that into humanities, and they've always had this intention to convince their peers and colleagues that this was a good thing to adapt. But for a complication of reasons, it never really worked out. It fell on deaf ears, and by now they are very sour about this, and they will sort of assume the worst when you approach them. And I've met these people a couple of times, and so they are still very good partners in this, but they need to be approached very gently because they're prickly about these things. Then we have the spider. These are full-time professors, and they are at the helm of a research team who's doing really exciting stuff with technology, integrating it into their research. It really falls at the mid to high level of digital humanities. But they themselves, these full-time professors, they don't do it. Like they don't know how to program. They don't really do. They have kind of reading knowledge of it, and they know how to sort of lead a team like this, but they are not the ones actually making the technology, right? But as full professors, they have this magical capacity to attract grants, and so with the grants they can hire people who are very good at integrating tech in humanities research. So this is a very important partner for us to push the humanities as a whole further in sort of digitizing our work. Then comes the blind and the lame. All right, so this is kind of a small version of this in a way. It's also usually a professor, and the professor is the lame one because in his or her 40, 50 years hasn't really gone much further than using Word and Outlook on their computer. And that's fair enough in a way, but and it's great that they're interested, they're excited about using technology. but right, they need a student or a hired professional, hired consultant to do that kind of work. And so they've got the right questions in their head, and they know the direction they want to go to, and they're kind of steering somebody to help them to go that way. I think it is not a great way of doing digital humanities. I think it would be much better to convince these professors to invest more in their students, to let those students become better either at the technical part or at the humanities, sort of the traditional methods and training. Because as a combination, usually it sort of falls short of achieving actual results. And the communication between the two is terrible. Believe me, I've been in the room. Then we have the centaur. So these are typically students, late-stage students, PhD students mostly, who are investing real time in learning technology. So this is a very interesting archetype. They are just doing a regular PhD in the humanities with sort of, a regular kind of question and methods, but they are really investing time to integrate technology into their research. So their head, so to say, is fundamentally humanities. They've got the vision of a traditionally trained scholar, but their feet, if you will, have turned sort of digital, and they are able to go the direction they want to go themselves. It has a lot of potential because this is a type of person who is self-sufficient, doesn't rely really on grants or on help. It can just they can do their own thing by themselves, and it's also drawing from basically the largest pool of people. These are students mostly, so it's a large group of students from which who can become these centaurs. Of course, the danger is that they become sort of fully digital, that they start to believe in it a little bit too much, at which point they become the believer kind of, and they drop out of their own field in a way. As a last archetype, I've got here the Obstinate Ostrich. And so these are people who really, they stick their head in the sand, and they really by choice don't want to be part of technology, right? They kind of feel it is sort of almost insulting that what they achieve by erudition and hard labor, somebody else achieves by a simple search in a database. I'm not sure if it's very visible, but the ostrich is holding a Molotov cocktail. If you become too enthusiastic towards these people, they will throw the Molotov cocktail in your face, right? They will be very negative about this. And it's a very important archetype here because lots of people in important decision-making positions are actually of this kind. And so we have to be careful lest they, shut down this DH nonsense, right? So this is sort of the whole spectrum right here as I see it. And so there's plenty of opportunity for DH to flourish in this middle part. We've got the manpower, but now, of course, what are they going to do? And this is kind of tricky because they're not everything is something that they can do. For example, you cannot do a bit of natural language processing. You either do it or you don't. It's very hard to do a little bit of it. So natural language processing finds a more natural place with the believers, for example. So there needs to be something else. And I think it needs to be something that is readily available, that is easy to use, and something that they will be able to gain results that closely align with their traditional training. And I think the answer is computer vision on manuscripts and books. You see, in manuscript studies, there have already been steps taken to make their workflow more digital. The unfortunate truth, however, is that they use digitized manuscripts as though they're physical manuscripts. If you open any handbook that was recently published, say in the last 5 or 10 years, a handbook on old books or manuscripts, then you will see that there is virtually no mention of digitization or of the fact that we use mostly manuscripts in a digital form. These handbooks, they completely assume that you're sitting right there at the table in a library with the manuscript in hand. So it's kind of like having an expensive sports car and not knowing how to shift to a higher gear. There is a lot of potential here that is already building up. And the technology of computer vision has a gentle learning curve with high payoffs already early on. The things that I showed, they were done in just a few lines of code, really. And so I think with relative ease, we are able to unleash this technology on meaningful resources. And then there's also, of course, the case that CV, that we already have the proper methodologies to, such as new philology or distant reading, so that computer vision is one of the most attractive things really to do at the lower to medium end of the DH spectrum. It can really greatly benefit the workflow analysis and end products of regular humanities research. What I've been doing myself in this regard, given the lack of handbooks, I've been working on writing a handbook myself. It's called Among Digitized Manuscripts, and claims to give a conceptual and practical toolbox for using manuscripts in a digitized sense, digitized manuscripts or in a digital workflow. If you go to this URL, at the bottom of the page, you can leave your email and you'll be notified when it comes out. Still waiting for one reviewer. If you're out there, send out that review, waiting for you. I'm also considering to write some sort of a cookbook that's more geared towards programming and really focuses on computer vision. But I think I would need a co-author, so if somebody of you is interested in doing that, that would be great. You see, my time only is limited because I'm supposed to be doing research on medieval philosophy, and so it would be even greater if somebody could just pay me to do this kind of thing, and then a lot of these things would be solved. Let's close here with some remarks how you can prepare for this. I think the best preparation is changing our hearts and minds, right? To not see the use of computer technology as merely something for digital humanities, but to consider simple implementations as part and parcel of our day-to-day work as scholars in the humanities. And in this regard, I'm more favorable towards a model of DH labs at libraries than I am towards DH departments at universities in a faculty. I think it would be really great to see more DH labs that can offer workshops in office hours to help students and faculty with their tech problems. I also wish to point out that there's, a real possibility here, a real opportunity to incorporate digital solutions. And with the advent of the digital age, such use of computers will one way or another become the norm anyway. So I would say avoid becoming the lame and don't be an ostrich. Computer vision has a uniquely high return on investment, and it's at the cusp of a revolution. So I want you to ask yourself if you are ready for the CV revolution. Thank you.